Well, while I was in seminary, my Camaro, many of you know I have a Camaro, my 68 Camaro sat in storage. Now, the first year I visited a couple times. Took it out and drove it, but I think it was the second time I went up, the battery was dead. And after that, it sat and wasn't driven for about 5 years. Well, after seminary, we moved up to Illinois, and we had the car shipped up there. And it arrived, and it wouldn't run. And so I worked on it. And I got most things in shape, but there was a problem with the carburetor. And I could get it to run, but not for very long. It would run and sputter and die. And on top of that, there was gas everywhere. I mean, just flowing out of the carburetor. I knew what the problem was, but I didn't know how to fix it. I needed more wisdom. I needed more understanding of how it worked and how to fix it. So when my dad came to visit, I leaned on his wisdom and we got it running. And we started it up and it ran and it didn't die. Wisdom is important. When Solomon asked God for wisdom, he needed it so that he could lead God's people well and so he could rule justly. If you remember, he was young and he saw what he needed to do and he said, this is a huge task. But he really wanted to do it right and do it well. He knew what he needed to do, but he didn't really know how to do it. He needed wisdom. And so God, who was very happy with Solomon's request for wisdom, God gladly gave him wisdom, gave him what he needed to lead well. And we see again, wisdom is important. And Solomon, here's the thing, Solomon already knew that, which tells me he already had some wisdom. He had enough wisdom to know he needed more. And so he asked for it. But wisdom is very important. And that's where we start this morning with the question, what good is wisdom? And we're going to see that there are some very practical benefits to having wisdom. So we'll begin in Proverbs chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. It says, by wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Now, first of all, I want you to notice these three words that are used in this verse. You have the word wisdom, the word knowledge, and the word understanding. And these are all used together here, but they all have basically the same meaning. They're all talking about the same thing. But with these different words used together, they can help us to understand what wisdom is. You see, wisdom is knowledge. But wisdom is more than just knowing. But of course, that's part of it. And he uses the word understanding. Well, understanding seems a little bit deeper than just knowledge. So let's put these things all together. And when the Bible speaks of wisdom, it's speaking of practical knowledge. In other words, you know and you are able to use what you know. Okay? You have knowledge, you're able to use that knowledge. When the Bible speaks of wisdom, it's speaking of skillful moral living. It's speaking of understanding that is then applied to life. And so he uses these three words. Let's read it again. Chapter 24, verses 3 and 4. It says, by wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Now, we read this Proverbs, and he could simply be talking about building a house. Right? I mean, it's true. If you are going to build a house, you need to know how to. In order to successfully build a house, you need to know how to do it. I'm sure you've seen some houses that have not been very successfully built. they don't tend to last long, or I've seen houses that are leaning. Something wasn't done right. I guess there is a reason for permits and inspectors. But in order to build a house successfully, you've got to know how to do it. But that picture here of building this house is applied to life in general. In order to live well in any aspect of life, you need to understand how life works. You need to understand what is right, understand what is best, and then as you apply that knowledge, you do well in life. And so this is very practical, he says. And when you have this knowledge, then those rooms of that house that you built are filled with precious stuff. In other words, when you have knowledge, when you have wisdom and understanding, then you can make money as well. He said things will go well for you. You will be successful at what you do. But simply put, what he's saying here is that we need wisdom. And when you have wisdom, it will allow you to be successful at what you do. Very practical answer to what good is wisdom. We'll turn back to chapter 3 of Proverbs. So all the way to the beginning here. Chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. Solomon writes, "Blessed is the one who finds wisdom, and the one who gets understanding. For the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed." And so Solomon here is telling us that gaining wisdom is a great blessing. This is very wise, and it gives us wisdom, and it makes us wise, and it has very practical advantages. And so being wise, Solomon knows exactly how to tell us this, how to say gaining wisdom is important. What's he do? He compares it to wealth, to money. He says it's better than having money. And I say he was wise because he knows that we all want money. He understands that everyone is wanting to gain wealth. Everyone wants to have money so you can buy stuff. In fact, you need money so you can buy your food and those kinds of things. And so Solomon taps into that and says, you know how important it is to have money, or how important you think it is to have money? It's more important to have wisdom. He says wisdom is better than what you gain from silver or from gold. But at the same time, he goes on and say, but if you have wisdom, then you also can gain silver and gold. He says that's, you'll be able to gain wealth. She helps you, wisdom helps you to be successful and to make money, and then you'll be able to manage your money as well. And so really it's a win-win situation. You can have both. But let's think about this very practical situation. If you have two people who say, I want to start a business, and the first person thinks about it, they do their research. What kind of business would be successful here? Would it work here? What's the best location? What kind of customers am I looking for? Who would I be selling it to? All those things, and makes a plan. Very wise. Then you have a second person who puts very little thought in it, just says, you know what, I want to open a business. And so they do it, without really thinking much at all about it. Who's more likely to be successful? The first one, the one who actually thought about it and put a plan, the one who was wise. Wisdom is very practical. It is very helpful. That's wisdom. But also, if you are wise, you are able to make better decisions. better life decisions, and in fact, you might even live longer if you're wise. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos that I've seen of usually young men who decide, I'm going to try and jump from this building to that building. And so they run and they jump and they fall just short, and you saw them just slide down the side of the building. Or who say, I'm going to jump off of this building into that truck that is driving by. And so they jump and miss and land on the ground, and you see them laying there in pain as they probably broke their tailbone. Or the people who say, you drive at me in your car at 60 miles per hour, and I'm going to jump up and do a flip over your car. Well, they do a flip all right because they jump and they don't get high enough. Their feet clip the top of the car and hit the ground. That's foolish, if I have to tell you. If you're wise, you make better decisions. And you just might live longer. Now, thinking about living longer, not only might you have a longer life, but wisdom also gives you a better life. He says it brings a life of pleasantness and peace. And this is a good thing because no one wants to live a long, miserable life. We want to live a long, good life. But of course, we know that ultimately, that long, good life and that wisdom comes from living in relationship with God. That good life comes from the wisdom of living in a relationship with God. And God gives peace. But we see here that wisdom is important. That wisdom is good. And he says, nothing you desire can compare with her. So, I just alluded to this, but if wisdom is so important, or if wisdom is so good for you, then where can you get it? What is the source of wisdom? Turn to Proverbs chapter 2. So back one chapter to chapter 2, beginning in verse 6. Where can you get wisdom? Verse 6, for the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth come knowledge and understanding. Now I'm going to stop right there. Can you get any clearer of an answer? Where does wisdom come from? God, the Lord. The Lord gives wisdom. It comes from God. He gives it. Now, the previous verses before this are talking about seeking wisdom and seeking insight and seeking understanding, and it's talking about fearing the Lord. And then we come here to this verse, and there's the answer. If you are seeking those things and you are fearing the Lord, then you will find what you're looking for. You will find wisdom because God gives it. Of course, this reminds me of James. When we study James, what does it say? If anyone lacks wisdom, let him do what? Ask God, who gives freely. Okay? But now, you might say, but you know what? I gain wisdom from life experience. People gain wisdom from life experience. And you know what? I would say, well, yes, that's true. But not everyone does. Some people experience things and learn nothing. Like the guy who jumps over a car again. Some people experience something and learn very little. And some people experience and learn a lot. But even if you learn a lot, it's still limited. Because the greatest wisdom, true wisdom, comes from God, who knows better than anyone how life is supposed to work. He created it. He knows what life is supposed to be like. He knows how to make it through life. The greatest wisdom comes from God. Well, let's read that back, chapter 2, verse 6 again. It says, For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Verse 7, he stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints. Then you will understand righteousness and justice and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Did you catch that? It says that God stores up wisdom. He stores it up, which makes me think that there's no shortage of it. All right? You don't have to wonder, well, if I ask God, is he going to be up there saying, well, where do I get it? I want to give her wisdom, but no, there's no shortage of it. There's plenty of it to go around, and he is ready to give that wisdom, to hand it out. But who does he give it to? What's he say here in Proverbs? He gives it to the upright, also known as the righteous. And when the Bible speaks of the righteous, who is it speaking of? It's speaking of those people who know God, who are in a relationship with God, and who are living for God in obedience to him. And then Solomon says he gives it to his saints. He gives it to his people, and he watches over them. He protects them. And in fact, I think one of the ways he protects them is by giving them wisdom. So then they make better decisions. They have wisdom to make good choices, and it enables them to live well, and then it enables them to relate well with other people. He mentions you can have justice and equity and all good things. You will act correctly towards people. You see, with wisdom, you understand what is right and wrong. With wisdom, you understand what is fair and what is just. Wisdom comes from God. And God's wisdom, this practical knowledge for life, it changes your heart, and it works to make you holy, and it brings you joy. But all of this begs the question, are you wise or not? Do you need wisdom? And do you listen and learn to gain wisdom? Are you growing in wisdom? Are you wise or fool? Turn back to Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. Very beginning of the book says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instructions in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, to the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So as he begins the book of Proverbs, he tells us the purpose of Proverbs. It's to teach you to be wise, and also how to be wise. He's teaching you how to live well. And he uses many different words to express this. And so I look at this and I say, well, it must be important, because he is telling us a bunch of different ways the same thing. That I'm teaching you to be wise, how to be wise, and how to gain that wisdom. But he uses all these different words. I want to look at a few of them here. First of all, he speaks of wisdom. Now, this word wisdom is used literally of skill or ability. In fact, several times it is often used in reference to like craftsmen, the skill of a craftsman, or of administrators, or of sailors. So in other words, it's people who know their craft and they do it well. It's a skill. So in this context, we're talking about skill for life, or specifically moral skill. And so he's talking here about having knowledge, having morality, having ethics, and then having those things then results in skillful, godly living. He also talks about instruction here. Now, part of gaining wisdom is being taught, and possibly even being disciplined, but then learning from that. He says the reason why we're doing this is so that you could understand words of insight. Now, it's interesting that the words understand and insight, the verb and the noun of that sentence, are really, they're the same root word. It's kind of like if I were to tell you, you need to go plant those plants. All right? And so he's saying you need to have understanding of understanding. All right? But he's saying you need to have an insight. You want to have understanding and insight into these things? Well, you need to gain wisdom. And so with wisdom, you're able to reason and discern what is right and what is good. You're able to understand wise sayings or proverbs. You're insightful. And then he talks about wise dealing. Now, this word wise dealing here, it refers to practical, successful living. That you know how to make it through life. This is what we would often refer to as common sense. But as some of our examples have shown, not everybody seems to have common sense. So it may not be common. But that's what he's talking about, that ability to just to know how to make it through life. Wise dealings. And then he says we're doing this to give prudence to the simple. Now, simple here doesn't mean stupid, but it just simply means naive or unexperienced. And so those who might be easily influenced by others, he says we want to give them prudence. We want them to learn to think well. We want them to be able to have good judgment and to make wise plans. And then he says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And this word knowledge here, like I've said before, is more than just knowing facts, but it's knowing and then being able to use what you know, being able to apply what you know to life. You see, this is wisdom. But then he says, but the fool doesn't care about this stuff. The fool doesn't care. The fool doesn't listen. The fool doesn't learn. But the wise person will continue to seek wisdom and continue to grow in wisdom. And he says the beginning of knowledge or wisdom is the fear of the Lord. In other words, the very start of wisdom is fearing the Lord. But that's not all that this word means. Beginning, it also has the idea of overarching, or the main idea, the chief aspect of. And so what he's saying here is the chief aspect of wisdom, the key to wisdom, is knowing and revering God. The key to wisdom is living in relationship with God and honoring Him. You see, true wisdom comes from a relationship with God. And this brings us to the most fundamental, important point of wisdom. And that is, what are your thoughts on God? You see, wisdom gives you the ability to live well. And most importantly, it gives you the ability to live well according to God's standards. And so having wisdom or lacking wisdom is directly impacted by your relationship with God. or your lack of relationship with God. And then that directly impacts how you live. Now, in the book of Psalms, in chapter 14, it's not a proverb, but it's a psalm, and this is David, Solomon's father, writes, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they do abominable deeds, there is none who does good." Now, in both Psalms and Proverbs, they speak about the fool. They speak about wise people and they speak about foolish people. And in both Psalms and Proverbs, the fool is a person who lives without thought of God, who lives in disobedience to God, and without being guided by godly morals. So this person lives as if there is no God. Why David says the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They live as if there is no God, and therefore he engages in whatever sinful activities he wants to. And by refusing to recognize the existence of God or submit to Him and then learn from Him, he has no access to true wisdom from God. And so he goes his own way and makes a ruin of his life. And this is exactly what we read in the book of Romans. Turn forward to the book of Romans. It's the 6th book in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans. But Romans chapter 1. Beginning in verse 18. I'll give you a moment. I hear pages turning. I know it was a long way to go. All right, Romans chapter 1, verse 18. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." So the beginning of these verses are talking about God's judgment on people's sin. And the Apostle Paul is saying that this judgment from God is just and it is deserved, which is then demonstrated by the rest of the paragraph that we just read. But this also ties in with our discussion about being wise or fool. You see, godly living is the result of wisdom, and that wisdom comes from knowing God and from learning from him. On the other hand, the fool ignores God, which then results in foolish, ungodly living, and ultimately in judgment. Now, who is it that will experience God's judgment on sin? Well, he tells us it's the unrighteous who don't do right and who suppress the truth about God. Now, this word suppress, it means just that they are suppressing it. They are shoving the truth down. They are trying to have nothing to do with it. But Paul tells us here that God has made the truth evident, even obvious in creation. But they have rejected that truth, that evidence. Paul says it's clear that God exists. It's clear that he is powerful, and it is clear that he, as creator, is greater than creation. Because the creator would have to be greater than what he has made. And so we see creation, we know there must be a creator, and we see that creator, and we know that God is greater than it. And if he is creator, and we are part of creation, then obviously he is greater than us. And that greater one is God. So he is God. And Paul says that they knew God. In other words, God put it within all people to recognize through natural revelation, through creation, that he exists. But people have rejected God. They didn't only ignore God, but they have suppressed the truth. They have actively pushed the truth away. Now that is foolish. As David said, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They were created to know God, created to have a relationship with God and to glorify him. But they have turned away from him and they have refused to honor him. And in doing so, they have become unable to discern truth, unable to discern right and wrong. And as a result, they have become morally corrupt and unable to think clearly, so much so that they have started putting other things in God's place. They turn to idolatry. They are worshiping lesser things rather than God. Now, we see this even today. Some people actually literally do bow down to statues and images of animals or other people. But we see it even today where people are living for money. People are living for sex. People are living for power. People are living for themselves. They have replaced God with something lesser. But even though they are doing something so utterly foolish, they think they're being wise. They have no ability to discern what is truly wise. Now, I don't say any of this with a sense of superiority or gloating. In fact, I say this in praise to God's grace. Let me tell you why. What Paul has said, this describes all people. And it is where we were before God changed our hearts and opened our eyes to Jesus and brought us to himself. You see, when Paul was writing this, it's ultimately leading to the fact that we need Jesus. That God must intervene in our lives and reveal the truth of the gospel to us so that we can see the truth and believe in Jesus and be reconciled to God and then live a life to honor him. You see, that is why God sent Jesus to this world. To come to live a sinless life and die on the cross in our place, to take the punishment that we deserved for our sin. Jesus, who never sinned, never did anything wrong, took that judgment on himself. Why? To pay the price so we could be forgiven. So we wouldn't have to suffer judgment for our sin. And God's word says that everyone who believes in Jesus is saved from that judgment. Everyone who believes in Jesus is forgiven of their sins, is made right with God, brought into a right relationship with him, reconciled to him, made a child of God, given new life so that we can live with him for eternity and we can live for him now. And it's through that relationship that we gain wisdom. We need Jesus. And that's what that shows us. And so I'm going to ask the question one more time. So are you wise or fool? Now, the way I understand Jesus and what he says, especially in the passage that we're going to turn to next, is that all people fall into one of these two categories, wise or fool. And it's based on which category you're in is based on how you respond to Jesus and the truth that he taught. Turn back to the book of Matthew, the first book in the New Testament. So to the left, about 5 books. Matthew chapter 7. Jesus has been teaching, and he gets to this point, and he says this, Matthew chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." See, Jesus is saying is you are wise if you truly believe in Jesus and you live out what he says. If you have built your life upon the foundation of Jesus. He says you are foolish if you don't. If you live your life without God, you've got nothing. And even what you think you have will all go away in the end. We live this life, we pursue things, we collect things, and when you die, you don't have it anymore. And if that's all you've got nothing. This life and all of the accomplishments of it, without God, are all for nothing. But if you live your life, if your life is built on Jesus, if you know Jesus and you are basing your life on him, if you are learning from him and living in his ways, then you're secure. You have eternal life, and you're able to stand up to the pressures and the storms of this life. You see, that's the great thing. When Jesus comes and he gives us life, he gives us eternal life. He also gives us strength for today. Jesus said, "I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly." If you build your life on Jesus, you will have wisdom for life. To live this life, we need wisdom. And as we saw, the fear of the Lord, that is, recognizing who he is and responding appropriately to him and living in relationship with him, the fear of the Lord brings wisdom for life. And most importantly, it gives us the ability to live a life that honors God. You see, that's the main thing. That is the importance of wisdom.